The contests were first announced in the New York Times and in Eugenics publications in 1928. The second of these contests drew 96 essays, of which 81 were from Germany and Austria, and only 5 from the United States. In 1933, the Draper Fund anonymously sponsored another contest through the ERA, this time for original research on the incidence of mental disorders in families. However, Draper had more overt political goals, and wanted to see eugenics developed as an applied science and to see social policy based on eugenic ideals. His funding of the ERA projects was about to end. Draper had become close to Harry Laughlin, the most energetic, policy-oriented activist among the eugenicists, as we have seen. In fact, Laughlin had been instrumental in getting Draper an invitation to the International Congress for the Scientific Investigation of Population Problems in Berlin in 1935. He was sent as an official delegate of the ERA, and Laughlin gave him a letter of introduction to Eugen Fischer. Laughlin asked Fischer to give Draper a favorable reception and described him as one of the staunchest supporters of eugenical research and policy in the United States. This brought together a major benefactor of eugenics policy in the United States with leading Nazi race scientists and eugenicists. Draper was ecstatic and immediately thanked Laughlin for paving the way for him with German officials. He informed Laughlin that when he returned he wanted to talk with him about several of the Germans who might provide him with useful information. Clarence Campbell accompanied Draper to the Congress. Campbell was then president of the ERA and served on the editorial board of EN. At the Congress, Campbell's speech included this rhetoric: "The leader of the German nation, Adolf Hitler, guided by the nation's anthropologists, eugenists, and social philosophers, has been able to construct a comprehensive racial policy of population development and improvement that promises to be epochal in racial history. The difference between the Jew and the Aryan is as unsurmountable as that between black and white. Germany has set a pattern which other nations must follow." At the closing banquet he made a toast to that great leader Adolf Hitler. Shortly after their return from Germany in 1936, Draper asked Campbell to join Laughlin and Davenport as judges for his third essay contest. The admiration of this group of eugenicists for the Nazis and their policies was unquestionable. In 1936, Madison Grant introduced Draper to Ernest Severe Cox and W.A. Plecker, both Southern white supremacists and separatists. Cox, 1880 through 1966, had read Grant's Passing and immediately devoted his life to promoting the exportation of African Americans to Africa. He was especially struck by Grant's comments in Chapter 7 that two distinct species of humans cannot live side by side without one driving the other out or forming a population of race bastards, with the lower type ultimately being preponderant. This stimulated him to write his Gobin-esque Grantian volume, White America. In 1924, Laughlin wrote an extremely favorable review of White America in EN, stating that the removal of Negroes from America would make Cox a greater savior of the country than George Washington. Laughlin had already familiarized Draper with this volume. Cox's familiar thesis was basically that the white race had founded all civilizations, that only the white race could sustain civilization, and that civilization would be lost as the white race became hybridized. This led Cox to propose that it was necessary to put African Americans in concentration camps and then deport them to Africa in order to maintain Nordic purity. Plecker, as discussed in Chapter 3, was a white supremacist who was one of the authors and main instigators of Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924. Grant introduced Cox and Plecker to his disciples Lothrop Stoddard and Harry Laughlin, and they had all become friends and worked together on Virginia's sterilization and racial separation laws. In fact, the three Northern scientific racists, Grant, Laughlin, and Stoddard, provided advice and acted as mentors to the Southern racists, Cox and Plecker, for years to come. Grant also introduced Cox and Plecker to Draper, and these three men also became close friends. Draper funded their projects, mainly anonymously, for the rest of his life. This was the beginning of Draper's long financial support for projects that sought to export African Americans to Africa. In light of the successful racist policies in Virginia, Laughlin suggested that Draper fund a eugenics institute associated with the University of Virginia. However, Draper established his own independent funding agency, the Pioneer Fund, which he incorporated in March 1937. Draper's close friend Madison Grant, then nearing his death, also provided financial support for this effort. As I will show, the Pioneer Fund continues to be the major source of funding for research that supports racist ideology and for projects that promote biological determinism and eugenics. The stated goals of the fund at its inception were to help with the education of children of parents who had unusual value as citizens, that is, parents who were descended from white persons who had settled in the original 13 states. The main reason for this support was to encourage those parents to have more children by defraying the cost of their children's education and thus ultimately improving the character of the people of the United States. The fund's second goal was to study and research the problems of heredity and eugenics in the human race and the problems associated with race betterment, especially in the United States, and to inform the general public concerning the findings related to heredity and eugenics. However, the Pioneer Fund is basically a propaganda organization for 15th century racism. Its first priority is to continue to attempt to convince the public that ancient, unscientific, eugenic, Nazi views of race are indeed scientifically valid. As Rosenthal, 1995, points out, the pro-Nazi Pioneer Fund has funded the work of every major advocate of racism, eugenics, and fascism since the late 1930s. According to its bylaws, the fund was to be managed by a 5-member board of directors, 3 of whom would be officers. The first president was Harry Laughlin. Laughlin was delighted and thought the organization would help the United States achieve the most patriotic development of racial ideals through the conservation of the best racial stocks, and would prevent increase of certain lower stocks and unassimilable races. At the time, Laughlin thought Ernest Cox was the nation's savior, and saw Nazi Germany as a role model, a perfect choice to lead Draper's funding corporation. The secretary of the fund was Frederick Henry Osborne, the nephew of Henry Fairfield Osborne. At the time, the younger Osborne's ideology was similar to Laughlin's. For example, he advocated that all known carriers of hereditary defects be either segregated or sterilized. He estimated that there were up to 5 million carriers of defects at that time, 3 to 4% of the United States population. Osborne later considerably modified his views on eugenics. The treasurer of the fund was Malcolm Donald, an attorney who had been managing Draper's finances and had executed George Draper's will. The 2 other members of the board were John Marshall Harlan, a lawyer who performed legal work for the fund and later became a U.S. Supreme Court justice, and Wycliffe Draper himself. In fact, only Osborne and Laughlin gave advice on the actual eugenic merits of any project, and all final decisions on any project were made by Draper. From 1937 to 1941, before the United States entered World War II, the Pioneer Fund supported only 2 projects of any significance. Both were conceived of by Draper and seem to have been influenced by his visit to Nazi Germany. The first was the distribution of the German film Erbkrank, The Hereditary Defective, with English subtitles. This was a Nazi propaganda film about the costs of hereditary degeneracy, such as feeble-mindedness, insanity, crime, hereditary disease, and inborn deformity, and how the field of applied negative eugenics was making substantial progress on a long-term plan to prevent such degeneracy. There were a number of anti-Semitic passages in the film. Laughlin gave the film a glowing review in EN. The plan was for the Pioneer Fund to advertise the film in 3,000 high schools and eventually loan out 1,000 copies for viewing across the country. This ambitious goal was never achieved, and in the end only 28 schools and a handful of state welfare workers in Connecticut actually viewed the film. The second project, and the only project to ever address the first stated goal of the Pioneer Fund, sought to increase the income of families of officers in the United States Army Air Corps who were considered to meet the standards set out in the original purposes of the fund. That is, the fund considered these families to be of unusual value as citizens and to be descended predominantly from white persons who had settled in the original 13 states. Financial assistance would be given for the education of children in these families in order to encourage the parents to have more children. The families who were eligible to receive the funds had to have at least 3 children already. 11 children from 9 families were given these grants of around $33,000 each in today's dollars. This project was similar to a number of positive eugenics projects being carried out in Nazi Germany at the time. The Pioneer Fund did little during the war, and from 1943 to 1947 there were no meetings of the Board of Directors, and no funds were expended for any project. However, Draper continued to support racist initiatives. After meeting Ernest Cox in 1936, Draper was so impressed with his efforts to create an America for whites only that he was willing to aid Cox substantially in his future efforts. Shortly after this meeting, Cox was surprised to receive an order for 1,000 copies of White America. Since the book had sold few copies, Draper had had to pay for the work to be reprinted, which he did anonymously. The funds were for Cox to strategically distribute the book for the maximum political effect. Cox sent copies to members of Congress and to state legislators in North Carolina and Mississippi. Cox soon reported to Draper that he had caught a willing fish. After reading his copy of White America, Mississippi Senator Theodore Gilmore Bilbo wrote to Cox that he had decided to specialize on the repatriation of the Negro and to make Cox's dream a reality. Bilbo has been described as one of the most ardent racists ever to serve in the upper house, or more vividly as the colorful, corrupt, race-baiting, anti-Semitic Dixie demagogue who had memorized entire passages of the passing of the great race. Bilbo had served in prison in 1923 after 2 terms as governor of Mississippi, and after leaving the state in a huge financial hole. After hearing from Cox of Senator Bilbo's interest in taking the cause of repatriation to Congress, Draper replied in a 1938 letter to Cox, "If I can be of help, pray let me know." In 1939, Bilbo introduced the Greater Liberia Act, which would have mandated the removal of every African American from the United States within a generation or so. From this time on, Draper helped Cox and Bilbo, both financially and with strategic planning, in their decades-long effort to get Congress to pass a repatriation bill. However, thanks to the growing civil rights movement, the efforts for repatriation legislation finally died in Congress in 1959. In 1954, Draper finally withdrew financial, though not moral, support for Cox's effort at repatriation after the Supreme Court had issued its decision on the Brown v. Board of Education case, although Cox continued to work on returning blacks to Africa until his death in 1965. The Brown case rejected the opinion that separate education was equal education, paving the way for desegregation in the United States. Although President Truman had ordered desegregation of the armed forces in 1949, segregation was still the law of the land, underwritten and guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. Around this time, Draper shifted the funding strategies of the Pioneer Fund towards other, more powerful racist, eugenic projects and anti-integration initiatives. After all, Cravens has stated, the United States was still a deeply segregated society with daunting widespread racism literally in the bones of its institutions. When Cox died in 1966, Draper wanted to honor him. He considered him a zealous defender of our race and nation. Draper's way of doing this was to reprint a pamphlet Cox had written on repatriation. The republication was done by Willis Carto, considered by some to be the most active and influential neo-Nazi and anti-Semite in the United States at the time. Carto and Cox had become friends after Carto read Cox's review of Race and Mankind and his White America. In fact, Carto believed that Cox was the dean of American racists. In letters to Cox written in 1954 and 1955, Carto expressed the belief that repatriation would be the only way to combat the niggerfication of America, and would also be the strongest blow against the power of organized Jewry. Cox had made his views on Jews clear in 1947 when he reviewed Ruth Benedict and Jean Wetfish's Races of Mankind. He wrote that it was part of the Boas conspiracy of the Jewish plan for world domination. At the time he was approached by Draper, Carter was in the process of republishing White America. The funding for this project was done, as usual, anonymously, funneled through an intermediary, the Virginia Education Fund. Frederick Henry Osborne, who had assumed presidency of the Pioneer Fund when Laughlin died, began to part ways with Draper in 1954. By that time he had modified his views on eugenics and refuted outright racism. Even in the late 1930s, Osborne had believed that there was little evidence of innate differences among groups, and had warned against assuming the superiority of any class or race over another. Believing that Draper's views had no basis in science, he rejected Draper's attempt to continue his funding of the AES, of which Osborne was also the head, and in 1958 he ended his association with the Pioneer Fund. After that, Draper reorganized the fund to mirror his own personality and viewpoints more closely. He was eager to take concrete actions to achieve ethnic homogeneity in the United States. Draper chose Harry Frederick Weyer, Jr., 1921 through 2001, to replace Osborne. Weyer and Draper were kindred souls, and he eventually made Draper's causes his own. He was a tax attorney from North Carolina who had been educated at the University of North Carolina and then Harvard Law School. Weyer was an unadulterated racist. He was a friend of white separatist Senator Jesse Helms's, and he was sympathetic to the struggle of Southern whites to maintain racial supremacy. Draper named John B. Trevor, Jr., who was head of the American Coalition of Patriotic Societies, as treasurer. Trevor Jr.'s history was linked to that of his father. Trevor Sr. had been a close friend of Madison Grant's, and, like Grant, a member of the social elite who traced his family roots to colonial times. He was a rabid anti-Semite and pro-Nazi, and was one of the principal architects, with Grant and Laughlin, of the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924. Trevor Sr. had once developed a plan to suppress potential mass uprisings of Jewish subversives in New York City, and had amassed 6,000 rifles and a machine gun battalion for deployment in Jewish neighborhoods. He also had worked on strategy, with Grant, Laughlin, and Draper, to stop a last-ditch attempt to give asylum in the United States to a few victims of Nazi oppression. In 1929, Trevor Sr. founded the American Coalition of Patriotic Societies, which became an umbrella organization for a number of far-right political groups, and which later helped distribute Nazi propaganda. Trevor Sr. was named in an indictment by the U.S. Justice Department for pro-Nazi activities. When his father died in 1956, Trevor Jr. took charge of the coalition. The coalition had a long list of enemies and expressed its opposition to any attempt to undermine the immigration laws by admitting more aliens. Membership of the United States in the United Nations and the presence of the United Nations in the United States, diplomatic relations with the USSR,